We're live.
All right, it is time to get started. Turn your Bibles to Exodus chapter 19. Exodus 19. And I have to admit, I was kind of excited that Joe is my co-teacher because we've talked about Ten Commandments, Sinai, Exodus quite a bit over the years, I think, on and off. So this is one of those lessons, too, where there's no movie. So you just have to listen to us talk. I know, that's disappointing, but you're just stuck with class this week. Just the two of us, right, Joe?
Yeah, and I think it's a good idea because, the minute they go to pick a spot for Mount Sinai, it's.
That's the problem is there's no way to pick a spot for Mount Sinai. There's not enough information. Essentially, that entire area is called the Sinai Peninsula. And for lack of a better term, it's just a mountain there somewhere. And it's not a specific mountain that we can find. So
Probably by design.
Probably by design. Yeah. Because just imagine if we knew what mountain it was, what humans would do with that mountain. What the Jews would do with it. We fight enough over that region as it is. Just imagine adding another area for that. Let's get started with a prayer, and then we'll get into class. I'm going to get Jared to lead us into prayer, and then we'll get started.
Dear most gracious Heavenly Father, we humbly come before you this morning thanking you for the rain that you've given us, thanking you for another day, the breath that you've given us, thanking you for this opportunity we have to gather to study your word. As we open up your word and we study your law, God, may we learn from it. May we learn more about you. May we grow closer to you. May we find parts of you that we can hide in our heart and things that we can work on, patterning ourselves and being more holy and righteous as you would have us to be. We're thankful for all the blessings you've given us. We pray that you watch over us, keep us safe. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
Yeah. All right, so as we get started, here's, again, the map. I think it's good to look at that sometimes and just and point about what we're talking about. One of the reasons why there's so many different colored lines and possibilities up there is because we don't know where this mountain is. And so there've been a lot of suggestions and a lot of assumptions over the years, but there's no way to solidify all of that. If you've read through the lesson, it starts off with this idea of a covenant, and that's really where we begin. And he begins in Genesis chapter 12. There in those first three verses, God makes a covenant with Abraham. And we often talk about the three things that were promised as a part of that covenant being the land, the seed, and the nation. And he reiterates that covenant in chapters 15 and 17 to Abraham. He also tells that covenant to Isaac and Jacob, both, on different occasions. The idea of what has been promised. Now, where we're at in Exodus is a fulfillment of that covenant with Abraham. It is the entire Exodus, and I think sometimes we get this kind of question about, well, when did they become a nation? And the reality is, from a technical aspect, we probably, from a historical context, would not consider them a true nation until they actually have a land and a law. Those are the two things that are required to have a recognized nation, essentially. But Exodus is kind of the birth of the nation. This is the process by which they're taken out of Egypt, where they are certainly the size of a nation. That's why the Pharaoh has such the issue he does. And they are then in this kind of transition to become the full nation once they cross into the Jordan and they have a land. That's where they really could be considered fully formed as a nation. But all that to say that process takes about 40 years for them to become a nation, in other words, from that standpoint. And as a part of that, what's going to happen is that starting here in Exodus chapter 19, there's a new covenant. And I don't know if I thought you think about this morning, Joe, whether we should think of it as a new covenant or maybe just even an expansion of the covenant he made with Abraham, because what he's doing here is really explaining this is what being a nation looks like. If I'm going to make you into a nation, it's going to be a nation of my people, and this is what that looks like to you and to the world, I guess is a way to put that.
I think you see glimpses in it. I mean, you see glimpses going all the way back to Genesis 2 when God sanctifies the Sabbath.
Yeah.
And sanctification is always involved in the covenant relationship. Blood's always involved in a covenant relationship. And we're probably jumping way ahead, but when you think through covenant with God, we always have to think those two things at least: sanctification and sacrifice.
Right.
And so.
Yeah.
But
And
yeah,
that's probably
there's
Wednesday night where we'll get into that in the details. But yeah, absolutely.
And you don't see all of that in Genesis 12. You see it kind of rolling out more in Genesis 15, where you see the blood taking place, and so there's this. It's not always. We like things in a box. We plan our days by the hour and do all that sort. That's just foreign to the concept of a Semitic person at this point in time. But that's going down a rabbit trail. So.
Yeah. Let's read here in Exodus 19. Let's start in verse 3. And John Clemens, I know I gave you Mike. Could you read verse 3 through 6 for us there?
While Moses went up to God, the Lord called out to him out of the mountain, saying, Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob, and tell the people of Israel, You yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings, and brought you to myself. Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice, and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all peoples, for all the earth is mine. And you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the people of Israel.
All right. So, by the way, does that language sound familiar to anything else that maybe you've read anywhere else? What else is very familiar to those languages, especially holy priest, holy nation? What's that sound like? Any ideas?
Sounds like.
Didn't Peter quote that?
Yeah, 1 Peter 2 is the same kind of language where Peter's telling, we're going to wrap up the study in Peter this morning, but where Peter tells those people who are sojourners, strangers, aliens, he tells them that that's who they are, but also says that they're a royal priesthood and a holy nation. And so you have that same language here. And it's interesting sometimes, just pointing that out, because a lot of times we read things in Peter, and some people want to think like, well, that's something new. Well, that's not new at all. And even though there was a Levitical priesthood, you see in Scripture, and especially here in Exodus 19, you see that God expected Israel to be an entire nation of priests to the world around them. He didn't limit that priesthood in that sense, in the sense it's being used here, to just the descendants of Aaron. He says all 12 tribes are priests in that sense. And that's always been something else we could talk about. The covenant people here's a covenant of God's people expected to be priest and holy and reflect his image. That too, we talked about that in Genesis 2 and 3 too. And that's part of why we say a lot of times all good theology goes back to the garden, is because we see these things already in the garden, and they're just being restored and reinstituted to an extent by God when he sets the people down and says this. So he says to them here, here's what you're going to be. He says that to Moses to tell them. So in verse 7, Moses goes down and tells them all of that. And what's their response in verse 8?
All that the Lord has spoken, we will do.
Okay, so it's kind of like, yeah, that sounds like a good idea. Easier said than done, right? So this is one of those times where it's like, well, that's easy to say. It's really hard to do, because all that God is going to speak for them to do is pretty extensive. The expectations are pretty high. But they are in agreement. This is one of those moments where we have the children of Israel agreeing and pledging their allegiance, for lack of a better term, to God at this scene.
And that's even before knowing what the terms are. And that's where the
We're
the
seeing
old
the true
saying.
display of his glory too. I
Yeah,
mean, that's the
yeah.
thing.
So,
Yeah,
but they don't realize the depth to which they're committing
Correct.
at this point, and they will.
correct. Yeah, they will. That's right. They will. This was in page 182, and this gets to the nation of priests. I thought this was a great quote. The children of Israel on their way to the promised land, where they would be a great nation, but God wanted them to be his nation, a holy nation, a treasured possession among all peoples, a kingdom of priests. The land of Canaan was ideally suited. It was a crossroads from Africa to Asia, from Europe to Arabia. If Israel obeyed God, then God could communicate through them his grace and peace to a world full of grief and enmity. His rule as the King of Heaven would be proclaimed to people who bowed their knee to impotent idols. And so that's something that I thought he did a really good job of putting together. The geographic location of where they're at, the importance of that location, but also what God expects them to do is all of these different people are coming through there. They're supposed to proclaim the greatness of Jehovah. They're supposed to be this kingdom of priests. And so that adds, I think, another layer to the selection of the geographic location as well. We often wonder, maybe we think sometimes because to us today, that little piece, that little strip of land that everybody fights over seems insignificant today because of all of the technology. And I mean, if I want to go from Europe to Arabia, I don't have to go through Israel. I fly over it, right? Or I can go around it, or I don't have to go through those areas necessarily. But back then, where everybody was walking, riding the camel, they were on foot. This was a major intersection of different routes. And whenever you have that, you have a lot of population. You look at, Birmingham's not so much this way, but the city of Nashville has grown exponentially. But part of that is because you've got 3 pretty major interstate routes for logistics. I mean, Jonathan could talk to that, but those are 3 major routes. 65, 40, 24 is the least of those, but it's a connector too. That's a big deal. That's created this massive place with a lot of transient people. Same thing was the idea here. Not necessarily people are settling there, but people are passing through. That gives them the opportunity to influence a lot of people, to make sure they know who God is and to proclaim his greatness and his goodness. So those are the expectations of the covenant overall. And I think one of the things to think about is that the covenant itself is written in a way that if you follow the covenant, will automatically make it natural for you to proclaim God's goodness and greatness, because that's what the covenant's really ultimately pointing you to.
Yeah, and it's when they get it, they'll see that it is countercultural.
Correct.
The very first commandment runs sideways with what every nation on earth believes at that point, which is multiple gods, a located God over their land, and those things are, and that's baked into their culture. So the very first one out of the chute says, no, this is different, and this is like nothing you've ever experienced, nothing you can even imagine, and so
Absolutely, yeah. Any thoughts, questions, comments about any of that before we move on? Nobody? All right, so then what happens is God essentially says, you've got 3 days, and prepare yourselves and prepare the area, because I'm going to come down to meet you. And so in verses 9 through 15, in these 3 days, what they do is they really consecrate themselves and they consecrate the place. They consecrate the place by essentially marking it off so nobody can go there for 3 days. And that's the way to let nature, essentially what you see there is God's allowed to let nature consecrate it and keep them off of the mountain, for lack of a better term. Mm-hmm. They wash their clothes, they set a boundary around the mountain, they don't go close, and they abstain from sexual contact. And all of this is to consecrate themselves to prepare to meet God, and to consecrate the mountain itself. And that may be odd to us, all of those rules. But it's also kind of, like you said, from the beginning, even this is hey, this is different than everybody else. And so it's interesting to look at it from that perspective, that here you have setting this aside. By the way, the idea of a God coming down to earth to meet with humans was not all that unusual. You've probably seen those temples called ziggurats. It's the weird temples, and even the pyramids are kind of a form of this, where they have steps that are going up. And the Tower of Babel was probably like that. And as we've talked about this when we've studied Genesis 11 before, that as a child, I often thought that the Tower of Babel was so people could go to heaven. But really, if you look at the cultural impact of the ancient Eastern culture, the idea is more likely that God could come down to them, that you're building stairs for the gods to come down. That was a common thought. You've seen Mayan temples, for instance, with those. That's the idea of a Mayan temple, is the same concept with an Aztec, those temples that go up. So that's not an uncommon thought, but here it's not a building, it's on a mountain that's already there. And like we said earlier, that's probably a reason why this mountain's not found, because they would turn this into a relic.
And there's not a lack of mounts or mountains in that area. And so the whole concept of sanctification is setting apart, making it is something different than all the others around it. And that's we should never miss that concept about sanctification, is that you're set apart. You're set apart for a specific. So everybody had clothes, but they were nasty. So let's sanctify those clothes before we go to worship. God deserves that. And then the second concept of, there was nothing inherently wrong. There's nothing wrong or inherently evil or anything about husbands and wives having sexual contact. But for this period of time, we're going to set that aside and consecrate our bodies, our clothing, and then this place to God. And
the intent too is to sanctify and set apart your mind through all this process, because there's an intentionality throughout the
no
process.
doubt, right.
And I was thinking about this also this week, about the comparison of this to the burning bush. So think about when Moses in Exodus 3 comes to the burning bush, and it's almost like a one-on-one meeting. God says, hey, take off your shoes, you're on holy ground, right? Mm-hmm. So that's the consecration, sanctification, a little bit. That ground had already been set aside, essentially, and was holy, and that was it. And now we have a much larger scale of the same thing. But when you think about what you're going to see, we read Exodus 3 and think in awe of this bush that will not burn, and God talking. But what we're about to read here is even more in awe, I think. So let's talk about what happens when God finally comes down on the third day. Jonathan, if you'll get Exodus 19, 16 through 20, and then Jared, if you'll go ahead and turn over to Deuteronomy 4, we'll get you reading. It's interesting how these Deuteronomy kind of adds some more meat to the discussion here. But read 16 through 20, Jonathan.
On the morning of the third day, there was thunders and lightnings and a thick cloud on the mountain and a very loud trumpet blast, so that all the people in the camp trembled. Then Moses brought the people out of the camp to meet God, and they took their stand at the foot of the mountain. Now Mount Sinai was wrapped in smoke, because the Lord had descended on it in fire. The smoke of it went up like the smoke of a kiln, and the whole mountain trembled greatly. And as the sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder, Moses spoke, and God answered him in thunder. The Lord came down on Mount Sinai to the top of the mountain, and the Lord called Moses to the top of the mountain, and Moses went up.
All right, then let's read Deuteronomy 4, and let's look at verses 10 through 14 for now.
How on the day that you stood before the Lord your God at Horeb, the Lord said to me, gather the people to me, that I may let them hear my words, so that they may learn to fear me all the days that they live on the earth, and that they may teach their children so. And you came near and stood at the foot of the mountain, while the mountain burned with fire to the heart of heaven, wrapped in darkness, cloud, and gloom. Then the Lord spoke to you out of the midst of the fire. You heard the sound of words, but saw no form. There was only a voice. And he declared to you his covenant, which he commanded you to perform, that is the 10 Commandments. And he wrote them on 2 tablets of stone. And the Lord commanded me at that time to teach you statutes and rules, that you may do them in the land that you are going over to possess.
So, Joe, what impresses you about this scene at Sinai?
Well, one of the things jumps out is there's darkness, but there's also fire. How do you do that? Yeah. I mean, we can't even envision that, but that's the description that he gives. It's otherworldly, one way of putting it. And Moses has already been there before. Imagine the opening act is a burning bush.
Yeah,
and now the whole mountain is so
burning but dark.
Right.
And thunder and what is going on here? What's the point of this scene?
Well, there's nothing on these mountains that can burn. That desolate place. There's no combustibles. It's a bunch of rocks. So this is obviously a a miraculous experience, because rocks don't burn
Right.
normally. It's just like you said, it's a fantastic, miraculous experience that's meant to make the people remember and understand that God is in control. Like, they're hard-headed. They haven't figured that out yet.
Okay. Yep.
We don't have that problem now in the 21st
No,
century.
no.
Okay.
Not at all. Not at all. Yeah. It feels like here that God's showing this nation His holiness, His power, and His sovereignty. I think that's the best way to sum that up.
Yeah,
is-
I couldn't say it any better than what he said in the book here.
Yeah, it's just trying to, and I think their response is probably a good indication of how effective that was. Because how do they respond? What's that? Yeah. Yeah. Look at verse 18 and 19. Mount Sinai was wrapped in smoke because the Lord descended on the fire of smoke, and as the sound of the trumpet grew, not 18, 19, that's the wrong place. Look at verse, down here, 21 starting. The Lord said to Moses, go down and warn the people, lest they break through to the Lord and look at many of them perish, and also let the priests come near. Moses said to the Lord, the people cannot come up to the mountain, set limits around the mountain, concentrate it. I'm looking for chapter 20, 18, 19. Sorry. There it is. Yeah. Why did I put 2? Oh, there we go. Chapter 20, 18 and 19. When all the people saw the thunder, flashes of lightning, sound of the trumpet, the mountain smoke, and the people afraid trembled and stood afar off and said to Moses, you speak to us, we will listen, but do not let God speak to us lest we die. So, there we are. Finally found it. Took 3 times. We don't want any part of God in this moment. That's also quite the contrast to Moses in Exodus 3 and 4, if you remember, because in Exodus 3 and 4, Moses kind of argues with God, right? So he has this one-on-one, I need you to do this. Nope, send somebody else, right? But here it's, hey, Moses, we don't want any part of this.
And God's not angered by this encounter.
No.
He's angered finally by Moses' encounter with him. But here,
Yeah, yeah. And what's the point of this here? How would we describe their reaction? Maybe. What one word would you use to describe their reaction? What? Fear. Fear. And fear can be used in a couple of different ways, right? One of fear is when you fear somebody, one way to interpret that is that you're afraid of them. What's another way to interpret that? Respect. And sometimes the line between those two is so thin it's non-existent. And what we have here is God essentially establishing the need to fear Him. And to fear Him because of what He can do. And you should respect this sovereignty and power. Now, if we go back to Deuteronomy chapter 5, and we look at Deuteronomy 5 in verses 22 through 29, Jared, do you have that? Almost. Yes.
The words of the Lord spoke to all your assembly at the mountain of the midst of the fire, the cloud, and the thick darkness with a loud voice, and he added no more. He wrote them on 2 tablets of stone and gave them to me. And as soon as you heard the voice out of the midst of darkness, while the mountain was burning with fire, you came near to me, all the heads of your tribes and elders. And you said, behold, the Lord our God has shown us his glory and greatness, and we have heard his voice out of the midst of the fire. This day we've seen God speak with man, and man still live. Now therefore, why should we die? For this great fire will consume us. If we hear the voice of the Lord our God any more, we shall die. For who is there of all the flesh that has heard the voice of the living God speaking out of the midst of the fire as we have, and has still lived? Go near and hear all that the Lord our God will say, and speak to us all that the Lord our God will speak to you, and we will hear and do it. And the Lord heard your words, and when you spoke to me, and the Lord said to me, I have heard the words of his people, which they have spoken to you. They are right in all that they have spoken. Oh, that they had such a heart as this always, to fear me and keep all my commandments, that it may go well with them and their descendants forever.
So God even says to Moses after this,
Yeah.
good, maybe they'll fear me. Like if that's the English version of that, right? Good, this will serve them well if they'll remember this and go fear me and keep my commandments. And what's going on here in Deuteronomy is Moses is retelling this second generation of people. He's reminding them, some of them who probably weren't born at the time, hey, here's what happened the first time you got the Ten Commandments. Here's the scene. Here's how your parents reacted. Here's what they said. And here's how that all happened. So all of that is really important. And before we open up for questions, here's a thought too, is we mentioned Genesis 11 earlier, but I want you to think about the difference between Genesis 11 and Exodus 19, because in Genesis 11, part of what's going on there is they think, and this is kind of what we see this when God says that they have knowledge, they'll make a name for themselves, we won't be able to stop them. In their minds, they're worthy of God coming down to their city. And that's why they're building this tower. We're going to be this great people. God is going to have to come down to us, so we're going to build basically this spiritual elevator system or escalator system for him to come down, because that'll demand his attention, because that's how worthy we are. And God says no, and he breaks it up, right, with the languages. And so what you have there is you have what among those people? You have a sense of what? Pride. Tremendous pride and arrogance. And what do you have here?
The opposite.
Yeah, fear and humility.
Yeah.
It's quite the contrast. And what you have in Genesis 11 is God's response is to do what? To break them apart, to scatter them across the earth, to divide them intentionally. And yet here, what he really is saying in Deuteronomy 5 is, good, if they'll remember this, it will actually unify them and keep them together. They'll depend on me and they'll be strong. And I want you to notice there that idea, though, of pride leads to weakness, and humility and fear of God leads to strength and unity, and how those two things are seen in these contrasting two stories. So interesting to see that. Obviously, Genesis 11 follows the rebirth of the world, and Deuteronomy 5, Exodus 24 are really the birth of a nation at this point. Yeah, go ahead.
Now, I was thinking through this over the weekend, thinking, where do you see this concept of fear being used in positive ways in our society? I would go back to high school with the wrestling program had been non-existent, and we had a coach that wanted to rebuild it. So he came in and he set up these rules, which included you got to make good grades also. So if you didn't make good grades, if you anything from a C down got licks, and so the first time through this, I didn't get any. I was fortunate not to score C or lower, but one of the players, a fellow named Colenso Hubbard, he got like 5 or 10 licks. Well, the next grading.
This is an old story because
Yeah.
they're still giving licks in
Because
school.
he played well. He wound up playing a defensive line for Bear Bryant at University of Alabama. But anyhow, so 6 weeks go by, and we get the next, and I got a C, and I'm just sweating it out. And Colenso comes in. He brings 4 Fs. I mean, he's got 20 licks he's looking at. And he's like, so, no big deal. He just doesn't fear it. And there's a difference. Now he wound up being state champion, but he still, You're wondering where I'm going with that.
No, I'm still stuck on the academic qualifications to play for Alabama back in the day. But anyway,
No.
So,
That's not the point. The point is
Yeah.
2 different reactions to you
Yeah,
quit
2 different
fearing.
reactions.
And we all love the coach, and
Yeah.
he wanted the best for us, but there was an outcome.
it was ineffective for him.
It was ineffective for it because he didn't respect it.
Correct. Yeah, Jonathan.
Just one thing to point out very quickly, this situation, Sinai, as opposed to Genesis 11 or any of these towers we think about people trying to build toward their gods, they were trying to entice the gods to come to them.
Correct.
And we see the exact opposite, like we do so many times at Sinai. The God comes to his people willingly and wants to be with his people. They don't have to entice him to come. He wants to have that relationship with them.
And then when he comes, they really don't want him there. That's
True.
Yeah.
I think one of the challenges we have is especially if you don't go back and study the Old Testament, is that, and we have to kind of balance the two, because God is our Father, and we sing the song, what a friend we have in Jesus, and sometimes in the community and other churches, they sort of water down who God is, I think. And when you go back and you read Exodus, I mean, he's fearful and he's sovereign and he's scary, and it's hard to balance all these traits of God, but that's who he is. And that's why I think studying the Old Testament is such a great thing to do, because you can see and learn a lot about who God is that we don't see necessarily in the New Testament.
Here's the funny thing about Exodus 19 is that's not wrath.
No, that's just who God is. That's how he shows up.
Yeah, that's like God's announcement, like, hey, I'm here, right?
Yeah.
But there's none of this that's anger. There's none of this that's wrath. And the reality is, to what Jonathan said, is God, all these other people want their gods to come down. That was a form of God's love. What you read in Genesis 19, that power, the darkness, the flames, the lightning, the thunder, that's God being love, saying, hey, I'm here. And the one thing they don't really get later on is, like, you know, when you talk about when we're in school and the idea of father, I mean, my dad can beat up your dad, right? And ancient culture is really a form of that. My God can beat up your God. And that's why they would carry their gods into battle. That's why you would take the trophy gods back to your temples, like a trophy case, like you see with the Ark and the Temple of Dagon, because it's my God's bigger than your God. How could you live through Exodus 19 and not be like, oh yeah, we got this? Because even when you add that on top of everything else that we've studied in the last 2 weeks, the crossing of the Red Sea, the plagues, the manna, the quail, the rock, water, the log in the water, the Amalekites, like all of those things together, and you have now this scene, and you put all that together. Well, we know what happens in Jericho, because Rahab's like, hey, we've heard all these stories. I don't want to be on the justice end of your God. I'll take care of you if you take care of me. I mean, that's the whole reason she does that, is because of what's going on here. Here's a Canaanite that hears these stories and is like, oh, you serve the Most High God.
Yeah.
But his own people don't get that.
Yeah. And to Jared's point there, it's we don't have an adequate way of describing it. I mean, the coach analogy was one that I attempted to use, but later on we see God inviting him up for a meal. And so you've got Moses and Aaron, and you've got Joshua, who incidentally, you read through all the accounts, he's not invited.
Nobody's there.
Joshua's there, and then the 70 elders of the tribe of Israel, and God's having a meal, obviously not face to face, because that's his love. He doesn't allow Moses to be killed because of his face to face vision of God, but somehow there is a meal that takes place. John?
No, I was just going to ask, so here in Exodus 19, from this scene, how many days away is the golden calf?
So it's after he goes back up and comes back down. I don't know that we have days there. Not long.
Not long.
Yeah, not long. But that fits the pattern so far, right? Because within a couple of days we have the complaints at the bitter waters, and within 2 weeks we have the complaint about food. So from crossing the Red Sea. So I think that's the thing to keep in mind. Again, is this should have taken about 3 to 6 months to cross the Jordan. The only reason it takes 40 years is because the spies go in and come out and say no, thank you. This could have been a very quick process had the people had the kind of faith they needed to have. But they chose a different path in that sense. Great comments. Anybody else? The terms of the covenant, and we won't read through these texts, but they're found in Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5. And they are known as, to us, the Ten Commandments. In Hebrew terms, it's often referred to the Decalogue, which is what I'll refer to it on future slides, which just means 10 words. Okay? For them, that's what they've called it, is the 10 words. And what I really wanted to point out before we go any further and look at those is that in page 187, he says, all the commands are rooted in the Lord's declaration, I am Yahweh your God. And this gets back to, now listen, there's the issue of how you view the Old Covenant. You have the 2 laws, you have the 10 laws, And then what is it? 613.
613.
613 commands when you break them down into specific commands. And you could look at all of that at 3 different tiers, but the Decalogue is essentially the marks of the covenant. I mean, ultimately. And everything kind of flows out of that, for lack of a better term. And so when we look at those, here's those 10 commandments kind of crammed onto one screen. And the very first one sets the tone. Mm-hmm. There's no other gods before me. It's also the one they're going to struggle with for almost the entirety of their existence till they go off to captivity. It's just going to be a continual problem to even keep the first of these 10 commands. They're going to always have, whether it's the Egyptian gods, the Canaanite gods, and we've talked about this too, that Baal and Asherah are likely in some cases specific, but they can also be viewed as just generic terms. They're different actual forms of Baal depending on the influence at the time. Baal's a male god and Asherah is a goddess. And it could be that those are just really not giving recognition to any specific god, but them following female and male pagan deities, for lack of a better term. But they're going to do that for pretty much constantly. I mean, even in times of what we would call reform, there's still some hangover pagan idolatry in the land.
And one of the things, and I've tried to emphasize this for years now, is that a careful analysis of all the books of the Old Testament leading up to the captivity, you see that they struggle with the 2 things that keep coming out, that they struggle with other gods, but tied to that other gods is the mistreatment of the fellow Israelites, and
that's the breaking of the
that's
two
the breaking
covenants.
of the 2 covenants.
Yeah.
And so, but you see, they're tied together. I mean, they're just not inseparable. If we have the right vision of God as a righteous God, a God who wants to be in covenant, as a God who punishes covenant violation, then we're going to see this is the what you say, honor your father and mother. Well, then we get into detail. All of it's tied back to the 2.
Correct.
But the 10 will get further sifted out and then by first century, the rabbis have got 613 that they've codified with the proof text beside each one. So,
right.
But it's still God's not he's not different. He says, okay, here's what honoring your father and mother looks like, and he gives detail. And,
right. Yeah, and I like how the book pointed out that honor your father and mother. We often try to divide these. Well, these 4 are about your relationship with God, and these 6 are about your relationship with man. But really, to honor your father and mother is almost a transitional one that is really both, because it's tied directly to even how it's presented. This is something God has commanded you. So when you don't honor your parents, you're not honoring God, is what that command says, even very clearly in the 10 Commandments in both places. And so it's almost like, hey, this is the connective tissue between those first 4 and the last 5 is the way you respond to your parents. But all of those up there are important, and they're about how we should look and how we should live as God's people and what that should look like. And I think that's the point that we should really see. And along those lines, here's a couple things from the book. The commands were not a 10-step program for building a relationship with God. Keeping them did not achieve holiness. Keeping them was a profession that God had already made them holy. And I like the way that is said, I think, is you don't keep the commandments to earn or work your way. I think that's another thing that's interesting, is today it's very common, like Jerry was saying, God, the God is love in the New Testament and God is wrath in the Old Testament that's often presented is just not true. We often will say, well, God has grace in the New Testament. It's a law of grace, and the Old Testament was a law of works. Well, that's not true either, because even if you kept the law, it was still the grace extended through the sacrificial system established by God of the taking of innocent life to cover your sins that even made it possible to be redeemed under the old law. I think, and we just miss that point.
And just being chosen as a people.
Just being chosen is grace, absolutely. And so God is a God of grace in the Old Testament. He's a God of love in the Old Testament, just like in the New Testament. And so those things need to be understood. God makes Israel holy. They don't keep the law to become holy. The law, and Romans says a lot of time on this idea, the law can't do that. It takes God to do that. And that's really important to kind of keep in mind. And whenever we develop this kind of idea, even today, we've talked about this, when we have the mindset that the way grace works is that I get to start over and then I have to keep the law and earn holiness through works after I've been baptized, if that's our approach, that's flawed too, because that doesn't work.
Even Paul said, according to the law, blameless. See, that's what he
Right.
said. Even though he says, I'm the chiefest of sinners, that's understanding grace here. But,
Correct. But he's blameless.
blameless according to the law, and
Yeah.
that's he's still so far from holy at that point that
Absolutely.
so
Absolutely. And then the second one that we'll open up for a few minutes, the Ten Commandments established for the people of Israel their moral identity. And this is really important to understand. This is, and Joe touched on this earlier, the Torah, the law, is going to make Israel look different than everybody else. Even laws that we sometimes don't think about, but like dietary restrictions, that made them stick out. And we know that from reading the New Testament in places like Corinthians, where there was this big problem about what you ate. And it wasn't even then just about pork versus beef, right? It was about where it came from and those kind of things. So we understand when we look at this that following the law and all of the requirements and instructions of the law would make you different than all of the nations around you. And that also meant that when you came through that land, to go back to what we said earlier, when you traveled through Israel and nobody was eating pork, right? Couldn't get bacon for breakfast. It was recognizable. Something's different. This law established them as being different than everybody else. There were not supposed to be. There are high places, but you didn't go and see a Temple Mount with 8 different temples on it. There was one temple in Jerusalem. It made them different than the entire world. And so it's important to kind of see the Ten Commandments that way. We don't have time tonight, today, maybe Wednesday night we can go through the different Ten Commandments, but we didn't really have time to do that today and kind of look at each of those, and we might be able to do that Wednesday night. So we have about 2 minutes left. Questions, comments, thoughts about any of that stuff as we wrap up. Feel free to add in here. Nobody? Joe?
the last thing you said, and for a third of their existence at least, it's a tent.
Yeah.
And so it doesn't look like the rest of the nations in that they haven't built something to venerate a false god. God dwells in a tent.
Yep.
And so.
Absolutely. Good thought. Anything else? All right, you get out like 2 minutes early. Here you go. Because if we're not going to start another section, it wouldn't be prudent. So, thank you.